So, you've heard the term Catholic, and I'm sure you've heard different explanations of it. Most commonly, it's translated as universal, but it also has the meaning of fullness, meaning completion. In the church, if our church is Catholic, the only reason it is Catholic is because it is Christocentric, because we're about the truth, we're about the light, we're about Jesus. And if we're not about that, then we're not full, and we're not Catholic. So if you run into groups or churches or religions or whatever, and they're not just focused like a laser beam on Jesus Christ, then they're missing the whole point of being a church. The leitmotif that's brought up by Lumen Gentium and applied to Jesus also bridges the Old and the New Testament. The Old Testament in Isaiah 42:6 and 49:6, we have the same imagery. 42:6 says, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness, I have taken you by the hand and kept you, I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. And then in 49:6, it says, you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So that was the first covenant made with the Jews, to bring the light to the nations. So even back in Isaiah, the Jews were being told, they weren't just for the Jews, they were being told you were to bring the light to the nations, which is the Gentiles, which is us. There are 8 chapters in Lumen Gentium, and what I want to do is kind of give you an overview of those, so that when you sit down and you go to read that document, and we can post this, I guess, on the Joe Catholic, you can sort of look at these chapters, and it'll help sort of get you into the document. As Don mentioned, this was written 50 years ago. All the church documents are originally written in Latin, and then they're translated into the various languages. And so sometimes it's a little difficult read, or it's a different read, I should say it that way. If you sit down and just say, okay, I'm going to sort this out, then you can get into the rhythm of how the documents are written. They're beautifully written. They're very clear and concise. But if you have a little bit of a roadmap, it may help. Chapter 1 is on the mystery of the church, and it addresses the church's supernatural unity. So that whole chapter is about how we're all one. And again, in the Gospel of John, there's that whole prayer of Jesus that we may be one. In John 17, the whole chapter of 17. The second chapter of Lumen Gentium is about the people of God, and it addresses the church's Catholicity. The emphasis there in this chapter 2 is on the fullness meaning of Catholic. And it addresses really 4 topics: the Messianic people of God, the common priesthood of the faithful. We talked a little bit about that in the conference. Sacramental life, and missions, and charism. Charisms are, a lot of people think of charism and charismatic renewal and, speaking in tongues and healing and all that, but in this context, charisms has to do with the gifts given by the Holy Spirit to us individually to help us in whatever role we have within the church or within our family or within our workplace. Chapter 3 is about the hierarchy, and it addresses the apostolic nature of the church, and it establishes that there is a hierarchy. And in the United States, when Vatican II came out, or when the documents started to come out, it was in the 60s, and if anybody here remembers the 60s, I mean, I think most of us were there, but some of us may not remember them. The 60s were about not paying any attention to authority, okay? Don't trust anybody over 30, all that kind of stuff. As if you can't have a hierarchy, as if there's any way to possibly have any kind of social gathering of any sort without some kind of hierarchy. So Lumen Gentium chapter 3 really addresses the hierarchy and the basis of it, the mission given to the apostles, and the apostles, commissioning bishops, etc., down to this day. Chapter 4 then is on the laity, and it focuses on the lay faithful mission, which is to accomplish through us as well as through the hierarchy Christ's saving mission. So it takes a whole chapter to make the point that it's not just the priests. In other words, we don't just go to church, sit there, go up, get communion, go sit down, wait for the last song to end, and then walk out the door and go on about our way. Because the priest is not in our workplace, he's not in the grocery store evangelizing, he's not at our dinner table telling our family how the day went or addressing topics of the day or anything like that. That's what we do. The priest ministers to us, we minister to the world. That's how we participate in the common priesthood of the entire church. Chapter 5 is on the universal call to holiness, and the universal would be the Catholic part of it as well. Holiness, the church's holiness. The church is made holy by the love of Christ, and in this document it is stated that charity is the essence of holiness. In other words, that giving charity, that love, that service for others, that honest, true caring, and not just caring but actually doing something about it, is the essence of holiness, because that models what Jesus did. Jesus walked around amongst the folks. He got down and dirty. He cured people. He was killed. He ministered directly, not from some, he didn't just sit in synagogue and teach. He did that, but that's not all he did. He was out in the world, and we're the ones who are out in the world, so that's our job. It then spends time on what they call the religious, and there's this kind of sort of a quasi-middle ground that people think of. They've got the priesthood, and they've got the laity, and then there's these people who are like nuns or brothers and things like that. They may take some kind of orders, but they're not priests, not all of them, so you'll run into friars or monks or whatever who are not really priests. You'll run into, there are lay orders, like you can be a lay Franciscan or a lay Dominican. I think you can be a lay Benedictine. I haven't heard of a lay Jesuit, but so those people are referred to as the religious, and what makes them a little bit different is they're sort of in the middle. That you can think of them as they're not really in the world, not really ministering to people sacramentally. What they're doing is they're a model of the orientation to the mission in a more spiritual way than in necessarily a more active way, meaning that they may spend a lot of time just in prayer. And as we saw in the talk in Luke, Jesus spent a lot of time in prayer. So these folks are kind of praying for all of us on a nearly continuous basis within those confines. So it talks about them and what they do, and whether or not really there's any value to that. Chapter 7 is about the eschatological nature of the pilgrim church, and that's a big word for saying end times. What the final is. Eschatology is the study of, okay, so what does it mean at the end? What are we doing? Where are we going? Why are we going there? What's it all about? And it's about we are in communion with Christ through his church today, because that models what we're supposed to be for all eternity, which is a church in heaven with Jesus. So we do everything that we can do today to unite ourselves to Christ's mission, because that is our end. We're supposed to end up in heaven, and we're supposed to bring as many people as we can. And then, so that's our final landing point. And our true peer group, probably not really thought about this way, but it's in this document. Our true peer group is the saints. As Father said in the talk, first the man, then the saint. And that's true about every saint. They were us, okay? And then they made that effort to become the type of individual who so fully modeled the goal and the mission of the church that we recognize them today as saints. That means it's open to all of us. Not that we're all necessarily going to end up with a feast day, but if we're ending up in heaven, we're a saint, and whether we're on a calendar or not is irrelevant. But that's our peer group. That's where we belong. Chapter 8 then ends with the Blessed Virgin Mary, and this specifically references God's regard for human dignity. There's an instrumentality to how God interacts with his creation, and what I mean by that is it's not intended as, it's not a slavery, it's just he works through us. So if I have to pound a nail into the wall, I can use my hand or my forehead, or I can use a hammer, okay? And the hammer is purpose-built to pound nails, and it does it really well. And that's an instrument. It's designed for a purpose, and when used properly, it does what it's supposed to do very well. There's an instrumentality to how God relates with this world, and in that instrumentality is a necessity of understanding our dignity. And our dignity is really to be drawn from the fact that Jesus chose to be a man. And that singular reality tells us that there's something special about being who we are. And from the very beginning, it's because we were made in the image and likeness of God. So we are made in the image and likeness of God. We're trying to model that as best as we can, and we're to cooperate with God's will, like Mary did. You know, a lot of people like to talk about how the church represses women, and they obviously don't know the church. I had a conversation with my sister one time who was telling me this, and I said, hold on, I'm going to argue with your premise. And I said, the women being treated like livestock predates Christianity. She said, well, yeah, I guess you're right. I said, so you can't blame Christianity for what was in place for millennia before there was Christianity. In fact, the reality of it is Christianity was the beginning of women being treated like human beings and not animals and livestock and property. I'm not saying we don't have a long way to go still, although honestly in this country I think we've arrived and then maybe gone overstepped. But the feminine side of the human race, male and female, he created them, is modeled in Mary, and it's modeled in the church. Christ is the groom, the church is the bride. So there's the chapter on Mary is to explain to us that when we open ourselves up to the transforming power of God's love, we convert ourselves, we reach our potential in recognition of our true human dignity. We then want to learn more, and then we want to share that good news with others. Sort of that encounter, convert, catechize, evangelize. So that's Lumen Gentium. I hope I've sparked an interest to read it. If you read the document, the fullness of what it means to be church is inescapable. It will help you really understand your role, and it will also give you some insights into the Mass. And plus those guys, they knew their Bibles, so there's some pretty good Bible study going on there too. Thank you very much.
Mark, on Vatican II, they had a lot of documents, but no real infallible teachings, correct?
So if I could add to that, I think that kind of part of what Lyndon's question was whether or not there was, you know, like you had referenced all the previous councils, and all the previous councils gathered together to address a particular heresy, and to clarify it. Vatican II didn't do that. Okay, there wasn't any particular heresy that was running around in the 1950s that Vatican II addressed. And so to say that there's no new dogma coming out of Vatican II would be an accurate statement. The Vatican II is a continuation of the teachings of the church. Not anything new there, in the sense that there's not any new teaching, the approach that that they take may be viewed as being used. And one of the stated missions from now St. John the 23rd was what Mark got his degree in, called pastoral theology. Isn't this touchy-feely notion of just social justice. It's taking the teaching of Christ to the people where they are. Okay? Like, and I don't mean that just physically, but like where they are in the way they're thinking, or where they are in their state of lives, whether, you know, some of you have probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, and so like if somebody's hungry, they're not going to listen to you about, their concern right now is getting food, not hearing the gospel. And so in the process of feeding them, you're witnessing to them, and then, you know, once you meet those particular needs, then you can start preaching the gospel. You're already doing that the way you live in your life. I mean, that's one example. But wherever they are in their particular state in life, you know, that that church is beyond just walls. Okay? That really, in chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Lumen Gentium, if you don't read any other part of it, I think those are two big parts to read as people who are lay people. Yeah, I'm looking around. Everybody's a lay person in here. That those are directed at us. We have this notion that the church is this institution that's either in Fort Worth or in Rome or maybe on some smaller level at 1705 Peter's Colony. And that's true. The church is us. We are the church. So when Mark talks about the saints being our peers, you know, we gave a talk back at the beginning of November that the communion of saints, if you look in the catechism and you look up the definition of communion of saints, the second definition is the church. We are the church. Okay, so actually I have two recommendations.
Take that a little bit farther too. When you're saying that we are the church, it's not just the people that actively go to church daily or weekly, but the whole world is the church. So all our brothers and sisters that don't actively build their faith are still part of the church. We need to administer to them.
So for those of you that might be taking notes, I'll post this on the website as well, but there are two real quick, you know, obviously you can download the documents of Vatican II off the Vatican website or EWTN or when I post the link on Joe Catholic. But if you like to read old school way and have a book in your hand, the publication that's put together that is most easy to find, it's called The Documents of Vatican II. The author's name is Flannery, the editor, Flannery. That retails for about $30, but you can often find that at half-price books for like $10. And then recently, since we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Vatican II, Ignatius Press put out a collection of the 4 constitutions, and Lumen Gentium is one of those constitutions. These are like the 4 heavy-hitter documents called the Second Vatican Council 4 Constitutions, Ignatius Press. You can find all these at the local Catholic bookstore. And that retails for about $16. Okay, so it's like the 4 big documents. So, as we're entering Advent, or about to in a couple of weeks, might be something that you want to incorporate into your daily reading. Okay? Remember we talked at the conference about incorporating spiritual reading. So beyond reading the Bible, you might incorporate, 10 or 15 minutes of reading one of the Vatican II documents. All right? Thanks, Mark. Let's give Mark another hand. All right. Encountering Christ. And that was the E of your little acronym at the conference, right? Of the ECHE. The first E. So, maybe I'll listen to 9:10 a.m. Catholic radio. All right? If you ever have an opportunity at the 9 o'clock hour, the priest named Father John Ricardo, he's from the Detroit area. He's a phenomenal preacher-teacher, okay? He's not, he didn't have a big voice, you know. He doesn't preach with brimstone and fire. He's just a good teacher. And every once in a while I catch an opportunity to listen to him, or I pull up his talks on the Ave Maria radio app, AMR. So if you listen to podcasts or things like that on your smartphone, AMR is the name of the app, Ave Maria Radio. And his talk on Thursday just kind of hit me, and which really got me thinking about what does it mean to encounter Christ. And that's why when I went over to Mark's house, I kind of persuaded him to switch topics with me. And so I'd like to start this off with the focus being Advent. How we're going to get ready for Advent. Because, and I don't want to steal too much from Mark's talk on Wednesday night, but if you look at the liturgical calendar, the majority of the calendar is green. Green represents what? Ordinary times, okay? And most of us live ordinary days, right? You know, most of the years, or hopefully most of the times ordinary. And then we have big events that take place. You know, maybe we celebrate anniversaries or birthdays or whatever the case may be. But for the most part, every day is an ordinary day, and that's the way it is in the church as well. We have big events. And if you'll notice, when the priest starts wearing the color purple, we have, and I kind of think of that as being like bookmarks of the years, of the liturgical year. We have the birth of Christ, we have the death of Christ. That's kind of like our lives too, right? We're born, that's a big event. We die, that's a big event, and everything in between. There's some high notes in there, some highlights, but for the most part, it's kind of most days are ordinary days. So during this time of Advent, we're called to really focus our attention at the coming of Christ. Not just the birth of Christ, but when he comes again. And we're all going to have our Jesus moment when we die, right? We're going to have our come to Jesus moment when we stand before him in judgment. And so he's going to, I just kind of envision it as him saying, do you know me? Do you know me? I was having those of you not know, I'm a high school teacher. I teach at a public high school in Dallas. And many of my students are Catholic. And they know I'm Catholic. I don't hide it. And they'll come ask me questions. And I have one of my students who's a senior graduating this year. I knew that she went to elementary school at St. Elizabeth of Hungary. It's in Oak Cliff. And the feast day of St. Elizabeth of Hungary is coming up this week. And I mentioned to her, I said, are you guys going to celebrate St. Elizabeth's feast day? I said, it's coming around the corner. And she started to say to me, she said, well, we don't really go to church anymore. And I said, well, were y'all Catholic when y'all went to school there, or were you just going to school because it was the good school in the neighborhood? I said, no, we're Catholic. We just don't have time for that. And before she could finish the statement, it hit her. And this is a 17-year-old girl, and it hit her what she had just said. Don't have time for what? And she had an aha moment. She said, yeah, we need to start going to church again. So, those of you that are a little older, a little more mature, might remember the old Baltimore Catechism. And one of the opening questions in there is something like, why were we made? Okay? And there are three things that we're made to do. To know him, love him, and serve. And we've talked about this before. We can't love who we don't know. How many of y'all are married? Okay? Most of you. When you first met your wife, you couldn't spend enough time with her, right? You know, you would go out on dates or talk on the phone or write letters. People don't write letters anymore, I know. But these days they text each other or whatever. But you wanted to spend every moment you could with her because you were getting to know her. Okay? And that's analogous to how our relationship should be with Christ. How can we know him? How can we love him if we don't know him? So how do we get to know him? We get to know him by having experience and encountering him. And I think that the church gives us three ways that we can encounter him on a regular basis. And those three things are the gospel, the liturgy, and the sacraments. And I'm going to talk about those in just a moment. But I keep coming back to this psalm. So, I'm going to be honest with you. Before I started taking these theology courses with Mark at Ave Maria, I kind of thought of the Psalms as kind of filler. They're like the flowery little songs that we sing at Mass. They're the in between the Old Testament and New Testament. I'm just going to be honest. That's the way I kind of viewed them. I never really spent any time meditating on them. How many times did we have to read this?
We were supposed to read them all in one sitting, beginning to end.
5 times?
5 times.
So 5 times during the course, we had a course on wisdom books. And Psalms is one of the wisdom books. So first of all, that was an eye-opener for me. Okay, because I always think of the book of Sirach as the ultimate wisdom book. But Psalms. And Psalms was the focus of everything, right? Was that fair to say? And we had to read Psalms, there are 150 of them, in one sitting 5 times. With the idea that Christ is the speaker in Psalms, right? And gave me a completely different perspective of the Psalms. It blew me away. But I keep coming back to Psalm 1. So I'm just going to read the first 2 verses of Psalm 1. The Psalm 1 defines what a righteous man is. Okay? Because 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 4, I think, says that we are all you're called to be a saint. To be a saint. So it's like, well, how do I get there? And so Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man. Blessed is the man who delights in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. And I share that with you because very early in the courses that we were taking, I asked a question of one of the professors. I think it was Bushman. This brilliant man who actually wrote the introduction to one of the collections of the Vatican II documents. He's brilliant. And we're talking about love of God or whatever. And I asked a question, and I wasn't trying to be funny. It's like, how do we know when we love God? If I'm supposed to, I think I know God. I've always been a student. I like to read. I like to learn stuff. Intellectually, I think I know what God is about and what he's teaching. But how do I know I love him? I think on some level I know that I love Stacy because when I hurt her or when I see her in pain, it hurts me too. I mean, how many of y'all feel that with your wives, right? When your wife's suffering, whether it's physically or emotionally, and you can't fix it, doesn't that tear you up inside? That's love, okay? Because you want the good for her, right? And ultimately, that's how love is defined. But how do I know that with God? And he just gave me a simple answer. He said, follow God's commandments. At first, I thought he was being funny until I saw this scripture. So if you go to Mass today, the psalm is going to be Psalm 112. This is what Psalm 112 says from the first verse. It says, praise the Lord. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commandments. Now, I didn't know that until this morning when I sat down this morning to finish the talk that was going to be today's psalm. So it ties back with Psalm 1. So, I know that Mark quoted quite a bit from the Gospel of John. We know that in the first letter of John, in chapter 4, verse 16, he says, God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. And then I had remembered something about Pope Benedict saying once upon a time that we have to have an encounter with Christ. So I Googled it. And it comes out of his document called Deus Caritas Est. That's the S. That's the first one we had to write about, right, to get in. So this is the Pope Benedict's first document that he wrote as Pope. Encyclical? Or apostolic letter?
It is an encyclical.
Yeah, so anyway, no matter what type of document it was, I think it was an encyclical. We had to write about this document in order to get admitted into Ave Maria. And then we did full circle at the end. We had an assignment where we could pull from that document again after having 3 years of study.
It's God's love.
Yeah, yeah. That's what, yeah, in Latin means God's love of art. Latin scholar's not here today. He sent me an email. He's sick. That's Charles Dillman. But this is what Pope Benedict said. He said, love is not merely a sentiment. Sentiments come and go. A sentiment can be a marvelous first spark, but it's not the fullness of love. And he goes on to say that love is an act of the will. Okay? And those of you who are married know what I mean. Okay? You know, the emotional feeling part of love, you don't always feel that. Okay? You have tough times, rough times, and sometimes you have to make a conscious decision to love your wife. That's not a bad thing. That's an act of the will. When you say, I will, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to love you through thick and thin, through good times and bad. That's an act of the will. That's why we say that in the sacrament. So that's the way that we're supposed to approach our love with God. And so one last scripture reading, and then I'm going to summarize the 3 main points. This comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. Kind of goes back to the very beginning when I quoted from the Baltimore Catechism. It said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Everybody heard that before, right? It's a good aspiration. It's like a little prayer that you can say throughout the course of the day. Lord, give me the grace to love you with all my heart, soul, and mind. That's an easy prayer. We can incorporate that. So, the gospel. Okay? Actually, this can be said about all the Bible, but I'm going to say it about the gospel in particular, because we know the gospel is what? The Gospels are the writings of the life of Christ. And as I've said in these workshops before, there's nothing wasted in those writings about the life of Christ. He was a perfect man. He's our role model. To go back what Father Alphonse said, first the man, then the saint. Well, who's the perfect role model for us to be a man? That's Christ. How can we learn to be a man but to study him in the Gospels? Okay? He worked. He got tired. He had friends. He had a good time, too, because he hung out at parties. We see that in the Gospel of John when he was at the wedding of Cana. That's a big party. Okay? He had close friends. Lazarus was probably one of his better friends. He wept. So all these things that we think of as just being normal human things are opportunities for us to be sanctified. And so how do we learn how to turn these normal, ordinary things into opportunities for sanctification? By studying the life of Christ, by reading the Gospels, meditating on the Gospels. So a couple ways that you can do that. Okay? You can just break open the Bible and just start reading. Get yourself a good study Bible. For the New Testament, I recommend the Ignatius Study Bible. It's black. It's available at the Catholic bookstore. I can't remember how much. $30, I think, for that. Very well done. Okay? Good footnotes, good commentary along with it. In addition to that, you can read Father Alphonse's meditations. I sent everybody an email for those links. That's another good way to do it. I try to post at least the Sunday Gospel on the Joe Catholic website with commentary from the Navari Bible commentary to give you one other tool to be able to meditate. Okay? But to get to know Christ through the Gospel, that is about his life. The liturgy. Okay? The primary thing about the liturgy that I want to talk about is participating in Mass, going to Mass. And an integral part of that is prayer. Okay, and so when we're praying, what are we doing? We're communicating. So I really should have 4 points on here: liturgy, sacraments, and prayer. Prayer. We got to have daily prayer time. Okay, just like I started this conversation by saying, asking you about your wives when you met your wife, when you were courting your wife. Okay, you had conversations, some of them very long conversations. Okay, if you had teenagers, you remember the times that they spent on the telephone talking to their girlfriends or boyfriends, right? On and on and on and on. Okay? But no relationship, no friendship can grow without communication. Right? You got to have some sort of dialogue going on. And notice I said dialogue. So we've got to talk to God, and then we've got to listen to Him as well. And He speaks to us through other people, through the gospel, when we go to Mass, etc. And then finally, the sacraments. The sacraments, we have to be sacramental men. Okay, and there are two sacraments that we get to participate in regularly. And one is the Eucharist. We can go to Mass every day and receive the Eucharist. And there, we're not only encountering Christ, but we're partaking of Christ, and we're allowing Him to become part of us. We come into communion with Christ. Okay? I can't think of a better example of encountering Christ than going to communion on a regular basis. And then also encountering Him in His mercy regularly with confession, with reconciliation. Okay? You know, I think I talked about this at the conference, that we should really strive as laymen to go to reconciliation once a month. Not just the bare minimum, you know, the precepts of the church say what? How often? Once a year. Okay? I don't think that's enough. All right, I'm going to post a link to this. One thing that John Paul II said about prayer and developing a prayer life comes from an audience that he gave to young people on March 14th, 1979. Powerful stuff, and it talks about how we encounter Christ through prayer. So as we get ready for Advent, where Advent is all about waiting for the ultimate encounter with Christ, we should, if we're not doing this already in our daily lives, what are we supposed to do during Advent and Lent anyway? We're supposed to amp it up. Okay? Or if we've wavered, get back on track, right? That's why we have these special seasons. If you didn't know that, that's why we have them. Okay? So a couple of things that we could do. Read Scripture. Get to know Christ. Okay? Participate in the liturgy. Go to Mass. Okay? During Advent in particular, if you can, try to go to Mass one more time a week. Okay? I like Wednesdays. All right? It's right smack in the middle of the week and kind of get me recharged for the rest of the week. If you go to masstimes.org, and they even have an app now. If you're traveling, you can find different places where you can go to Mass. But here locally, we're pretty blessed. I mean, I think St. Rita's got a Mass at like 6:30 in the morning. And then you can go to Mass as late as 7 p.m. at the cathedral downtown. If you work near downtown, Cathedral has a noon Mass. St. Jude's has a Mass like at 11:30. St. Rita's got a Mass at 5:30 in the afternoon. So does Mary Immaculate. So there are different opportunities nearby.
St. Anne's and Coppell has like a noon Mass.
Okay.
And Mater Dei in Irving has a noon Mass.
There's daily confessions at St. Jude.
Say again?
Daily confessions at St. Jude.
Yes.
Two other 6:30 Masses, Prince of Peace Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and All Saints every day of the week, 6:30 Mass
In the morning?
in the morning. Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. So lots of different options. So maybe one day of the week you just wake up a little bit earlier to go to Mass. I know that our Mass time at 8:30 is not always convenient for people that work. So just in preparation for the Advent season, to really work on having a close encounter. Not of the third kind, but of the best kind with Christ. All right. Thank you. All right, so we have about